Hello, viewers, and welcome to my channel, Jackson's Journal. My name is Matthew Jackson. Today, I want to talk to you about a podcast that I've been viewing on YouTube called, the name of the podcast is called Feet of Clay, Confessions of the Cult Sisters. Now, they have a presence on YouTube and on Facebook. And of course, the Facebook page is Feet of Clay hyphen Confessions of the Cult Sisters. Now, their YouTube channel is entitled Tracy Sharon. So Tracy space Sharon. And they have their uh, videos on there. They have a total of 32 videos. They have 229 subs and about 46,000 views. So, anyway, the title of my video today is Feet of Clay Confession of a Non-Cult Brother. So, I am identifying myself as a non-cult brother, where Sharon and Tracy are identifying themselves as cult sisters. Now, the reason they're identifying as cult sisters because both of them were once members of Last Days Ministries. Now, I was in the Agape Force Ministries from 1977 to 1982. And I was living in the Garden Valley area in East Texas at the same time Tracy and Sharon were serving in Last Days Ministries with Keith Green. Keith and Melody Green started the Last Days Ministries in 1977. Then in 1979, they moved to East Texas, not far from where I was at the Agape Force Ministries, just like 2 miles up the road on Highway 110, that close. And so I was very familiar with Last Days Ministry. I even made a few trips over there. I've been there about 3 or 4 times, met some of the people, talked. I don't ever remember meeting Tracy or Sharon specifically, but they were there when I went there and they were involved in the ministry there. So, yeah, I have some connection. And when I listened to about maybe 5 or 6 of their podcasts, and I remember them telling some stories about what it was like being in Last Days Ministry. There's a lot of things that they said that rang true, that spoke to me, go, yeah, I can relate to that. Some of that stuff went on in the Agape Force as well, maybe not in the same way as it did in Last Days Ministry, but I could kind of relate to them. I could, it struck a chord. Now, and of course, they're contending because there were some abuses there that they had experienced in Last Days Ministries. They're contending that Last Days Ministries was a cult. And that's probably where I would differ, because a lot of the same things that went on at Last Days Ministries also went on in the Agape Force. However, I would not go so far as to say that the Last Days Ministries or the Agape Force was a cult. Now, did what went on at Last Days Ministries and in the Agape Force, are those some things that cults do? Yes. Okay. But does that make Last Days Ministries and Agape Force a cult? No. And the reason I say that is because cult is a theological term. Because what makes a cult is their perception of Christ and who he was, and their Christology is off. So when I think of cults, I think of stuff like, the Mormons, the LDS, Church of Latter-day Saints. I think of Jehovah's Witnesses. I think of Jim Jones. I think of the Unification Church, whom we call the Moonies. All right, Children of God. Those guys are cults in the truest definition of what a cult is, because their Christology is off. Their perception of who Jesus is is off. So Keith and the Agape Force, Keith Green and Last Days Ministry, they believed that Jesus was the Son of God. They believed in his deity. They believed in the virgin birth. They believed in his death, burial, resurrection, and his parousia. Okay, so those are the core fundamental things that you have to believe in order to be a Christian. So even though maybe some weird things went on at Last Days Ministries, as is the case with Agape Force, as weird as they were not, that does not make them a cult per se. Okay. Now, I did, but I could identify with Tracy and Sharon as they described what was going on and what it was like to be in Last Days Ministry at the time. Now, some of the podcasts that I listened to, they talked about Melody Green's book called No Compromise. She wrote a book called No Compromise, and it's basically a biography of Keith Green. Okay. And of course, they objected to the biography because they felt it didn't paint an accurate picture of what went on in the Last Days Ministry. They thought it was too sugar coated. It didn't. They objected more to what the book did not say than to what the book said because they felt that the book was misleading and gave you an image of Last Days Ministries that really wasn't real. Now, Tracy and Sharon were both integral parts of Last Days Ministry during their tenure there. They were not just rank and file scrubs. I mean, they had prominent positions within the organization. Sharon, in particular, was married to Martin Bennett at one time. Martin Bennett is her ex-husband. Martin Bennett was the executive officer of Last Days Ministries. He was Keith's second in command, right-hand man kind of guy. So, yeah, he was high up there, so obviously Sharon would have been as well, being married to Martin. I don't know much about Tracy's husband and what his position was in the ministry, but suffice it to say, they did do a podcast rebutting some of the points that Melody made about her book, No Compromise. They also did two, maybe three podcast on the plane crash on July 28th, 1982. Keith was in a plane with some other folks, and the plane crashed. And of course, he died, and it's a big story, and he died at age 28. Suffice it to say, they did some podcasts on the plane crash, speculating and giving their perception and their take on the plane crash because they were there at the time the plane crashed. They knew a lot of things. They knew Last Days Ministries actually had three pilots, not one. Don Brewmeister was obviously the pilot involved in the plane crash, but there were two others. So they knew Don Brewmeister very well. They knew the other two pilots well. And so they were able to do some investigation. I would say that Tracy and Sharon practiced good journalism. Their speculation was based on things that they knew. They did their research. They interviewed pilots and did research on the dynamics of aerodynamics, I should say. You know, how the heat and the humidity would have an effect on air flight, stuff like that. They really did their research, but they gave some speculations as to what they think might have caused the crash. And who knows? They might be right. We'll never know. But they gave us their take, and they just gave us their take in general on the Last Days Ministries. I did not know Keith all that well, and had very little contact with him. I've been to several of his concerts, lots of his concerts actually, but several. But here I'd like to show you a clip that I did back in 2017, where I talked about Keith and my encounters with Keith. Roll it. At the Agape Force Training Institute, we have a gymnasium. We had a lounge with a pool table, ping pong table, and a TV. And on occasions, you would see Keith there with his with people from his ministry, using our recreational facilities. So Keith was very available. I could have easily have walked up to him and introduced myself to him and got struck up a conversation had I made the effort to do it, but I just didn't. I just said, well, that's Keith, and I didn't think anything of it at the time. I didn't know he was going to die at age 29 in a plane crash and become a legend. It was just Keith. And the only time Keith and I ever had where we actually exchanged words, it only happened one time. And on the campus of the Agape Force Ministries, we had a sort of a restaurant called Grublet's Hideaway. And I was working on a Saturday night at the Grublet's Hideaway doing my shift, and I was handling the ice cream parlor part, and he came up to me and ordered a double scoop ice cream, but he didn't want it on a cone. He wanted it in a plastic dish, and he asked me to squirt some chocolate syrup on it, which is sort of unusual because it wasn't on the menu. But hey, I can be flexible. If he doesn't want a cone, that's okay with me. So I charged him the price of what a double cone would have been, and I gave him the price. I forgot what the price was. I don't know what the going rate for double cones were back in those days, but I gave him the price. He gave me the money. I gave him his change and said, thank you very much. Enjoy your ice cream. And that was it. That's the only time Keith and I ever spoke. That video clip that you just saw was published on my other YouTube channel called CCM Drummer. And I did a 5-part series called The History of CCM. And the part three of that 5-part series, I did a piece on Keith Green. So that's where that came from. So yeah, allow me to shamelessly plug my other YouTube channel, CCM Drummer. I do drum covers. I play drums and then cover songs, particularly CCM classic songs. And 3 of my drum covers were Keith Green songs. I've covered 3 of Keith's songs. They were Because of You, Soften Your Heart, and You Love the World. So yeah, if you want to see me play drums to those 3 songs, go to my other YouTube channel, CCM Drummer. Anyway, moving right along here. Now, of the half dozen or so podcasts that I listen to, obviously, much of they talked about Keith while they knew Keith and worked with Keith, lived with Keith, and they talked about his impulsive nature and his eccentric nature. And of course, now I must emphasize or add that you did not really have to be a member of Last Days Ministries to know about Keith's impulsive and eccentric nature. I had also witnessed a little bit of that myself. Here's an example. Roll the clip. One thing that was really peculiar about Keith, he did have some eccentricities about him. He was a very down-to-earth guy, but he was a little eccentric in some areas. And one area I noticed in particular is when Keith went to the salad bar to get his salad. Usually you eat your salad before you eat your main meal. So Keith goes to the salad bar. He loads his plate up. So here's his plate, right? And his salad was literally stacked. I'm not kidding. I'm not exaggerating. It was a foot tall. I mean, he really stacked that lettuce and tomatoes and cheese, salad dressing, and all the things and trimmings that you put on a salad that are a salad bar. He actually
stacked it up really high. And I was watching him go back to his table to go eat with the entourage that he was with. And I nudged the guy next to me and I said, doesn't Keith know that you can make multiple trips to the salad bar? You don't have to load up your plate like that. But yeah, that was kind of weird.
So, about a half dozen or so of the podcasts that I listened to by Tracy and Sharon, they spent a good deal of time talking about Keith's um, impulsive nature and eccentric nature, but they also spent a lot of time talking about Melody Green and how she managed the Last Days Ministries after Keith had died, after the plane crash, and um, they weren't too pleased about how Melody got Last Days Ministries involved in politics, and of course, Melody Green started an organization called Americans Against Abortion, and they uh, commented they didn't like Melody getting arrested at an abortion protest. Now, let me show you a picture of Melody getting arrested at an abortion protest. Here it is. This incident occurred on July 19th, 1988, in Atlanta, Georgia, at the Surgery Center abortion mill. Okay, Operation Rescue staged and organized a series of rescue missions in the month of July in 1988, and Melody Green participated in that. Now, let me just say this. I was a pro-life activist from 1984 to 1992, and I did 8 of those rescue missions. I was arrested 8 times by doing abortion protests, doing sit-ins at abortion mills. Okay, so naturally, I'm going to be biased in favor of what Melody did there. When I saw that video, I go, okay, way to go, Mel. You go, girl. So yeah. Now, does that mean that I agree with the way she managed Last Days Ministries and that I'm contradicting what Tracy and Sharon said about Melody's management style and running the ministry? No, if they perceive, I mean, they were there, and if they say that Melody did not run the ministry well and she was not a good manager and she was incompetent for the job, I have to take their word for it. They were there, I wasn't. However, I do endorse and support what Melody Green did because I did that too. So, anyway, let me just close this video with this thought. I once read a bumper sticker that read, "Dear Jesus, please protect me from your followers." Now, Jesus's followers can do some pretty crazy things and sometimes can do some very hurtful things. People can get hurt. There's not a day that goes by that I don't experience some sort of PTSD from my experience in the Agape Force for 5 years, because there's a lot of abuse that went on there. And I have no doubt that Tracy and Sharon experienced uh, abuses, manipulation, control, those sort of things in the Last Days Ministries they were in. But here's the deal. I find it very unfortunate that both Tracy and Sharon have rejected their Christianity and they no longer identify as Christians, even though I hear their ex-husbands are still Christians, but they in particular are not. Personally, I think that Tracy and Sharon threw the baby out with the bathwater. And that's oftentimes what happens when people get hurt by Christians, um, when they're part of organizations that are very hurtful. I don't necessarily think that Tracy and Sharon are better per se, because I read some of the comments in the comment sections of the podcasts that are on their YouTube channel, and there are people who think that Keith Green is a saint and he's a legend, and you shouldn't criticize him. Well, I mean, Keith Green's a legend. He can take it. Okay, he can take the criticism. Um, there is not a person. I mean, if you were to talk to those people who were close to Billy Graham, I'm sure they could tell you some stories that weren't too flattering about Billy Graham. So we all have our dark side. So yeah, Tracy and Sharon, they did tell some stories that let you know that Keith Green was not the knight in shining armor that most people think that he is. Okay. And the same was true in the Agape Force. Tony Salerno and a lot of the leaders under him, they weren't the knight in shining armor that we thought they were. So I can relate to that. And if somebody was to do a documentary on the Agape Force, and telling us what a great guy Tony Salerno was, I probably would do a rebuttal video and keep it real and say what actually happened. Okay, so Tracy and Sharon, I acknowledge their right to tell their story. They were in Last Days Ministries for a long time, both with Keith and without Keith. They have a right to tell their story, and I don't necessarily think that they're doing it in bitterness. I do think it's unfortunate that they threw the baby out with the bathwater and rejected Christ in the Bible. Now, I myself, I am not the same kind of Christian I was back in 1982 when I left the Agape Force. I have since recalibrated a lot of the false assumptions that evangelical Christianity has put forth in the Agape Force in particular. I don't think the same way I think back then, okay? But I've never rejected Christ. I've never rejected the Bible. In fact, those are the two things that have been my North Star, that have been my fixed reference point. Because when you recalibrate your thinking, you got to recalibrate it to something, to a standard that's more reliable and more objective than you are. So that is my video for today. I really enjoyed listening to Tracy and Sharon. I hope someday I could talk with them and we can compare notes. And, there was a girl I met at Last Days Ministry. Her name was Pody. She was the kind of a tall girl, kind of. She had brown hair and wore glasses. I'd like to know what happened to her. Does anybody know? And if you know, let me know in the comment section. Anyway, that's all I have to say about Feet of Clay, Confessions of the Cult Sisters. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel, Jackson's Journal. Also, go to my other channel, CCM Drummer. If you want to see some drum covers of the CCM Classic, check out my channel, and please subscribe to that as well. Thank you, and God bless.